Alright, so listen, I know it's been over a year since I've made a video, but trust that I haven't retired. I've been busy with other things, so I didn't really have any time to power scale. If you follow me on Instagram, you'd know that I plan on returning, and when I do, my goal is to post consistently. This isn't my return. That will be sometime at the end of this year or maybe early next year. This is a debunk to one of the silliest power scaling videos I've ever seen. For those that don't know, a power scaler that goes by ShonenKon released a video titled Multiversal Bleach about 3 months back. Though ShonenKon is a very knowledgeable Bleach scaler, he's also extremely biased, and he will argue for essentially anything to upscale Bleach. I've known him for a few years now, and we've even debated a few times. Now, if you look at my channel, you'll notice that a majority of my content concerns Bleach, and a significant portion of it focuses on debunking absurd Bleach scales. Hell, one of my most popular videos is me debunking 10 different nonsensical arguments used to scale Bleach. So when it comes to Bleach scalings, we're essentially polar opposites. Because of that, I subscribe to his channel and I watch his videos on a somewhat regular basis. That is when he uploads. So when I saw that he uploaded a video titled Multiversal Bleach, I was very intrigued since I almost wholeheartedly disagree with that stance. But upon watching the video, I was astonished by the sheer stupidity in his arguments. There were multiple times where I would just pause the video and ask myself, what is he saying? Never in my life have I seen such an erroneous video presented with such confidence. Immediately after watching the video, I went down to the comments to see what people were saying. Surprisingly, there was absolutely no criticism against the blatant nonsense he was speaking. It was almost as if he was deleting the comments criticizing him. This led me to rewind the video, open Google Docs, and write a short essay debunking all of the nonsense he said in the video. I don't precisely remember the timeline following this since it has been 3 months and I wasn't planning on making this video, but I believe I posted the essay on my Instagram story and tagged him. After he replied and said he's not reading it, I decided that I would rewrite the essay and drop it in his comments. After all, if he's refusing to respond to my criticism, I'll just put it somewhere where others can see it. I also posted a link to the revised essay on my Instagram story. And with that, I just went to bed, woke up, and began my day as normal. Once I returned from work, I checked the comments to see if anyone was saying anything. Imagine my surprise when I found out he deleted my comment. To be precise, I don't think he deleted it since I could still see it on my own account, but when I looked for it on another account, I couldn't find it. So it would be more accurate to say that he hid the comment. Anyways, after tagging him again and exposing him for hiding criticism, he simply ignored me and didn't respond. Not wanting my 2,000 word essay to go to waste, I posted it on my YouTube community page and left it at that. I had a few people ask me to make a video on it, with some people telling me how trash his video was, but I was on a hiatus, so I just left it at that. 3 months passed and this entire debacle was a distant memory to me. But very recently, I had a debate that lasted 5 hours. Yes, 5 hours on a call debating just this one guy. We began around 9 AM and we ended at 2. It was crazy. We spoke about a lot of stuff, but the conversation was mainly centered around Bleach. The reason I bring this up, other than its outlandish length, is that during the debate, he brought up various points that rang a bell. After asking a few questions, I realized that he had watched ShonenKon's video and argued for a lot of the same things. He said he got these arguments from other sources as well, but this was when it clicked to me that I should actually make a video on this. With my essay that thoroughly debunked a lot of the arguments having already been written, all that was left was to reformat it, and here we are. To give you his thesis, ShonenKon argues for multiversal Bleach, but he doesn't do so for the normal reasons. You know, like Yuha destroying all of the realms, or more recently, Senjumaru shaking them all. But no, he argues that Bleach's cosmology scales to a low complex multiverse level, or 5 to 6D, and he explains why many of the series' top tiers will scale to this level. This is a ridiculous notion that has been put forth by Bleach glazers for years, but the way he argues for it is profoundly stupid. Something important to note is that I won't really be talking about his claims concerning Bleach's inverse scaling and things related to it. The reason for it is that what he says is either correct, or I've already discussed the topic on my channel. With that being said, here I present my debunk to Multiversal Bleach by ShonenKon, Bleach's biggest glazer.
Before we even get into the Bleach scaling, I first want to say that there are multiple different interpretations of what the fourth dimension is, because we as people in reality don't truly know what it is and if it even exists. There are still ongoing debates and theories about what the fourth dimension is, but there are generally two interpretations you see in fiction. One of which is that the fourth dimension is time, which is one of the most widely accepted theories of the fourth dimension. This idea was popularized by Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which treats time as a dimension similar to space. In Einstein's theory, space-time is a fourth dimensional continuum in which events are described by coordinates in both space and time. The other interpretation is that the fourth dimension is a higher dimensional space. In mathematics, the concept of higher dimensional space refers to space with more than 3 spatial dimensions. While we cannot directly perceive higher dimensional space, mathematicians use it in various fields, including geometry and topology. An example of this would be a fourth dimensional hypercube, also known as a tesseract, which is a geometric figure analogous to a cube but with 4 dimensions. The interpretation that Kubo uses for his fictional verse is quite obviously that space and time together make a fourth dimensional structure and the inclusion of general relativity. It's stated verbatim in the novels. Now there are
in the opening section of the video, ShonenKon asserts that there's 2 interpretations of the fourth dimension. One is that it is a higher spatial dimension and the other is that it is time. He then claims that Kubo uses the latter interpretation within Bleach. While ShonenKon isn't wrong in this section, it is very important that we clearly define what constitutes a dimension before reasoning further. In a mathematical space, dimensions are essentially the amount of coordinates you need to describe an object's position and/or qualities. A point is 0D, a line is 1D, a square is 2D, and a cube is 3D. This is Euclidean geometry, and time is not the fourth dimension in this sense. When people who are knowledgeable say that time is the fourth dimension, they are referring to how, in our universe, you need 4 values to determine the position of something. 3 of these values are spatial and the other is temporal. Thus, you have 4 dimensions. I won't explain it in detail here, but the reason our universe is said to have 4 dimensions is because of special relativity. Here's an easy way to understand it. Let's say I ask you to meet me at the peak of Mount Everest. You know the spatial location, but if I don't tell you when, you'll never meet me there. I could mean in 5 minutes, 5 years, or 5 eons. If you don't have time, you can't triangulate my position. It's kind of like those time traveling memes. That's why to determine position in space-time, you need 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal. This is all important to note, as he says this interpretation of the fourth dimension is what Kubo uses in Bleach. He doesn't substantiate this claim, but let's move on.
So the Bleach cosmology is a macrocosm that consists of a multiverse of low 2C space-times. These space-times are displaced across and separated by an extra dimensional space that allows them to exist in parallel. Additionally, there are larger space-times that encompasses the multiverse and the extra dimensional space. The lesser space-times each have their own temporality separate from the time dimension of the extra dimensional space. This is because each individual space-times are stated and shown to have their own time axes, and because these extra dimensional spaces is stated to be cut off from and separate the time and space of the other dimensions. This might be confusing, so I'm gonna simplify and correlate these terms to these specific dimensions. The world of the living, soul society, and the other dimensions are space-time continuums. Various pieces of evidence postulate the idea that the world of the living is based off our great universe. Not only the fact that there are the same locations that exist in reality, including celestial bodies like Mars and Jupiter, but the scientific studies we also know to exist, like astrology, which is not really scientific, and the scientists that exist in the verse have discovered and made the theory of general relativity in the verse, which means they are capable of observing and analyzing their universe in the same way we can. So logically, at the basic level, the paradigm of the world of the living would be the same as our universe. Additionally, Eisen states that he would cause distortion in time-space, and Pachi was able to tear through time-space fabric, along with the multiple other statements of space and time. The soul society is stated to be a parallel dimension to the world of the living and 2 sides of the same coin. So we would be led to believe that the basic attributes of the universe would apply to the soul society. So how do we know that the soul society and world of the living are separate space-time continuums with their own timelines? For 3 specific reasons. 1, they are stated to exist separately and independently from each other. It's to the point where they can't exist in the same universe because their very material makeup can't coexist. The second reason is because they're stated and shown to have separate time axes. It's stated that the time axis of the soul society and the world of the living went out of sync, therefore causing a time gap to happen between the 2 dimensions. So this means that the soul society and world of the living each have their own time axis. The thing is that they are both both synchronized, meaning the time flows are at the same rate. This is also supported by the fact that the social society and world of the living are represented by two separate paths. When Ichigo and Friends were thrown off the time axis, they were sent back in time when they entered the social society. This isn't the only occurrence of the Cleaner sending things back in time, and that leads us to my third reason. The Dangai. The Dangai is a dimension that is isolated from the social society, world of the living, and even time and space. It's stated to connect and separate both of these dimensions. This means that the social society and world of the living can be argued to be separated space-time dimensions just based on this fact. Being separated and isolated by a structure that is isolated from the time and space of each respective dimension would have to mean that each dimension has their own spatial temporal axes that they do not share. They cannot physically share a time axis. In conclusion, what this means is that each dimension is their own 4D space-time continuum, but this is just the beginning.
In this section, ShonenKon goes on to assert that all of the realms in Bleach, or at the very least the Soul Society and the living world, have their own quote-unquote time axis. According to him, this makes them 4-dimensional space-time continuums that are isolated and enclosed by the Garganta, which also has its own quote-unquote time axis. In this section, ShonenKon is half right. Yes, the Garganta, Soul Society, and the living world have their own quote-unquote time axis, but this doesn't necessarily make them 4-dimensional. Simply having flowing time is not what is meant by the idea of space-time. Space-time exists because of relativistic effects. Length contraction and time dilation make it so that different observers may perceive the duration of something and the distance between two objects or their size differently. This isn't just about having a quote-unquote time axis. It's about space and time being variable, and in order to properly describe the position of an event, you need to take into consideration relativistic effects, among other things. The very, you can say, geometry of our universe isn't intuitive, it's quite complex. Authors, I'm not saying Kubo does, often disregard or misunderstand countless laws that bind our reality in their fictional stories. Because of this, many things that happen in fiction could not possibly happen in real life, even if they invoke physics or mathematics as a means to explain something. The very makeup of our universe is one of these things, but I digress for now. This looks like it isn't going anywhere, but trust me, I'm creating a necessary basis for you to understand the sheer nonsense he's about to speak.
Now that I've proven that the Bleach realms are space-time continuums, my next point is that parallel space-time continuums are separated by a 5th-dimensional axis. To put this into perspective, two 1-dimensional objects require a 2-dimensional space to exist in parallel, which means that 2-dimensional objects require a 3-dimensional space to exist in parallel. In the third diagram, we have a space-time continuum depicted as a line composed of endless static representations of 3-dimensional space extending to the past, present, and future states of a universe. In this model, 3-dimensional spaces could exist in parallel, non-intersecting states when displaced across different time periods. And finally, 4th-dimensional space-times would have to be displaced across a 5th dimension to maintain their non-intersectionality. As stated in the Versus Battle Wiki's tiering system, the distance between any number of universes is embedded in a higher dimensional, higher order spaces. And the distance between two timelines is defined as the 5th dimension, or a 4th spatial dimension that separates two or more universes. But just because a multiverse is composed of multiple space-time continuums doesn't mean the cosmology is low 1C, and a lot of people fail to understand that. To scale to low 1C, the space between timelines either needs evidence of having qualitative superiority or quantitative superiority on account of being infinite in size and therefore infinitely larger than a 4th dimensional space-time. This would be the Cartesian product model of a low 1C hyper timeline. The construction of the multiverse consists of 4-dimensional space, 3 of which are significant, and 2 dimensions of time. Under such a cosmology, you would need to prove that the lesser space-times have their own temporality separate from the time dimension of the extra-dimensional space. As I've stated before, in the microcosm of Bleach, the individual space-time have their own time axes, which is the most straightforward way of proving low 1C hyper timelines. Since we have a confirmation that the lesser timelines have their own time axes, such a construction can only be described as a cosmology with 2 temporal dimensions, possibly 3 if we include the Garganta, but I'm going to talk about that later.
ShonenKon makes a lot of claims in his third argument, and this is where everything takes a turn down stupidity lane. Firstly, he says that parallel space-times are separated by a 5-dimensional axis. This is likely a conclusion he seeks to prove with his following points, but he doesn't present it as clearly as one would desire. Secondly, he claims that lower dimensional objects require a higher dimensional space to exist in parallel. To prove this, he shows us a graph where two parallel one-dimensional lines are represented in a two-dimensional space. Thirdly, he says that three-dimensional spaces can exist in parallel but in non-intersecting states when displaced over time. Fourthly, he asserts that four-dimensional spacetimes need to be displaced across a fifth dimension in order to be parallel and not intersect. Fifthly, he says that, according to Versus BattleWiki, the distance between any number of universes is admitted or embedded, I'm not sure what he said, in a higher dimensional / higher order space. Sixthly, he claims that the distance between two timelines is defined as the fifth dimension or fourth spatial dimension that separates two or more universes. Seventhly, he says that just because multiple spacetimes exist in a multiverse, it doesn't mean that the cosmology is five-dimensional, and this is something a lot of people don't understand. Eighthly, he says that for something to be five-dimensional, the space between timelines needs to be superior in quality or quantity and be infinite in size, thus making it infinitely larger than a fourth-dimensional space-time. And lastly, ShonenKon claims that the Cartesian product model of a fifth-dimensional timeline would be four dimensions of space, three of which are significant, and two dimensions of time. Under this cosmology, he said, you need to prove that the lesser spacetimes have their own time dimension separate from that of the extra dimensional space. Okay, there's a lot to break down with all of these claims. To simplify it, ShonenKon is attempting to argue that in order for a realm to house multiple parallel spacetimes, it must be made up of another spatial and/or temporal dimension. His point here isn't entirely clear as he doesn't explain it well enough, and he claims that five-dimensional status is granted to the aforementioned realm if it is quote-unquote quantitatively or qualitatively superior to the realms while also being infinite in size. He doesn't justify why this has to be the case, and most of what he says here has no basis in dimensional scaling or mathematics. It's like he's just inventing stuff. Nevertheless, his premise lies in his second point. He says lower dimensional objects require a higher dimensional space to exist in parallel. There's absolutely no basis for this claim, and his only proof is the parallel lines he displays in a two-dimensional space. He basically says this: look, in this very specific example, you need two dimensions to have two one-dimensional objects stand in parallel to each other. This means that for any lower dimensional object that is parallel with another, you need a higher dimensional space. He then concludes that since spacetimes are made up of four dimensions, you need a five-dimensional space for them to be parallel. This is an obvious example of faulty generalization. And what he means by existing in parallel is ambiguous here. In the most common sense, parallel means that two things extend in the same direction but do not intersect. For example, if you swim along the beach and maintain a roughly equal distance away from the shore, you're moving in parallel with the beach. In his example, he shows us two parallel lines in a two-dimensional plane. The lines are one-dimensional, and the reason they require a two-dimensional plane to be parallel is because of the heavily restrictive nature of one-dimensional spaces. With one-dimensional spaces, you just have one coordinate, so you can't really have two things that don't intersect but are moving in the same direction and/or are at the same distance apart. Even with other definitions of parallel, the best you can do is have two separate lines along the same one-dimensional plane, but that's not really parallel. When you have more dimensions to work with, however, it becomes far easier to display objects in parallel without needing a higher dimensional space. For example, I can show you two parallel squares in two dimensions. I don't need the third dimension to display this. Also, in our three-dimensional world, there are countless examples of parallelism, and they aren't lower dimensional objects. Even if you wanted to say he meant spaces and not objects, there is still no substantiation for that claim. He claims that three-dimensional spaces can exist in parallel but non-intersecting states when displaced over time. This confuses me, since if anything is intersecting, then it isn't parallel, leading me to question what he means by parallel. Ignoring all of that, the diagram he shows us with this statement depicts squares that are supposed to represent a three-dimensional space continuously repeating as if they were changing with time. He claims these squares are parallel, but this wouldn't be the case since he's using time to describe a sequence. I cannot be parallel to myself in the past since he doesn't exist simultaneously with me. His entire diagram doesn't make any sense with the word parallel unless you're using some kind of figurative definition or something of the sort. Something else to note here is that there's no need to say 4-dimensional spacetimes, since spacetimes are made of 4 dimensions. It's redundant. ShonenKon's seems to believe that 2 separate spacetimes can't exist within a larger spacetime, and it is necessary that this larger spacetime be 5-dimensional. If he believes something along that line, how does he explain pocket realities? Does their existence imply that the actual universe has 5 dimensions? Or is it that since they aren't parallel, it is just a smaller 3 or 4-dimensional structure? The next thing I want to talk about is the versus biowiki stuff. For one, using versus biowiki as a source is kind of crazy. He doesn't provide an explanation based in math or physics. He just cites versus biowiki as if there is some kind of authority. However, despite this, he completely misunderstood what they said. In the cutoff statement he showed, they didn't say that the distance between 2 or more universes is embedded in a higher dimensional space. What they said was that because the distance between 2 or more universes, if they were embedded in a higher dimensional or higher order space, is unknown, you can't upgrade a character from Universal Plus to Low Multiversal. In essence, they're saying that multipliers can't be used to upgrade characters since there's no way to quantify the numerical gap between universes. In other words, you can't say that if a character becomes 2 times stronger than one that destroyed a universe, this other character can destroy 2 universes. That's what they're saying. They didn't say that any space that has 2 universes is a higher dimensional space, at least not in that statement. It is one thing to use versus biowiki as a source, but misrepresenting what they're saying, whether willfully or accidentally, is insane. Moving on, he doesn't explain what makes a space, quote unquote, qualitatively or quantitatively superior to another. He uses these words to appear smart when all he is saying is that a space housing other spacetimes needs to be superior in quality or quantity to be classified as 5-dimensional. I don't even know what he means by that, and he doesn't even attempt to justify it, so I'll just ignore it. He also doesn't justify why a space, quote unquote, infinitely larger than a 4-dimensional one entails a 5-dimensional space. That isn't how dimensionality works, and something quote unquote infinitely larger than 2 dimensions is not 3-dimensional. The reason I'm putting infinitely larger in quotations is because I don't agree with how infinity is commonly used in power scaling, but that's a whole other topic. Getting back on track, he speaks about a so-called quote unquote Cartesian product model of a 5-dimensional timeline. But again, he doesn't justify why it would look the way it does, nor does he explain what that even means. He claims such a timeline would have 2 temporal dimensions, but what does that even mean? Our space-time is about how relativistic effects shape our universe's geometry and how we need time to accurately describe the position of an event, making our coordinate system 4-dimensional. So how does a second temporal dimension fit into that, and how would it even work? This entire section is a bunch of nonsense. He doesn't explain or justify the basis of his argument. He makes a plethora of claims after this that aren't even worth talking about, since the foundations of his arguments have completely fallen apart. This just goes to show that he doesn't know what he's talking about and is just glazing Bleach for the sake of it.
Kisuke Uruhara, one of the most knowledgeable characters in the verse, states that there is a hyperspace between the world of the living and Soul Society, and he's talking about the Dangai. Hyperspace in this context would simply mean a space with a higher dimensional order. This solidifies what I've stated earlier. What separates 2 space-time continuums must be a higher order space.
The next argument he makes is Power Glazer's favorite term, hyperspace. When speaking of the Dangai, ShonenKon claims that Urahara states that there is a hyperspace between the living world and the Soul Society. His interpretation of this is that Urahara is saying that Dangai is a higher dimensional / higher order space. After all, a hyperspace is defined as such. The first problem we run into is how the term hyperspace is being used here. I've spoken about it before when people tried to make a similar argument for Garo's so-called hyperspace gates. But I'll speak about it here again in greater detail, as I've always hated how people try to use this word to glaze their favorite series. Yes, hyperspace is a term used in mathematics to describe spaces with more than 2 dimensions. This definition is the first one that appears in most dictionaries, and it is the more sensible one. However, it is not the only definition, nor the most popular. Within works of science fiction, the term hyperspace is mainly used to describe a space that allows for interstellar travel at faster than light speeds. In essence, it functions as sort of a separate space-time that connects two different points within a universe. According to Brave New Words, the Oxford Dictionary of Science Fiction, which yes, it is a real thing, it is a book published in 2007 by the Oxford University, and it describes itself as, quote, the first historical dictionary devoted to science fiction. In it, the term hyperspace is defined as follows. Hyperspace, originally used in mathematics to mean a space of more than 3 dimensions, it is a dimension, continuum, or other theoretical region coexistent with, but having different physical laws than, the space-time continuum we inhabit, especially one with laws that permit an object entering from one point in our continuum to exit into another point more quickly than it takes light in our continuum to travel between those 2 points. Following this, several examples are listed. The Merriam-Webster also defines the term as, quote, a fictional space in which extraordinary events happen, end quote. They also give many examples, most of which relate to faster than light travel. But TV tropes define it the best and far more comprehensively. I won't read it because it's a lot, so pause the video if you want to know what it's saying. Also, for those that don't know, TV Tropes is essentially a wiki that lists countless tropes in fiction. They don't just list them, however, they explain them in extreme detail, with countless examples from a plethora of different media being listed. So, a hyperspace can mean both a space with more than 3 dimensions or a space that has different physical laws than our own, usually allowing for faster than light travel. I know which one you'll think I'll try and argue for, but before I do, allow me to point out something. When ShonenKon's shows us the source for this statement, we can see the original Japanese text. From this, we can observe that the term hyperspace is translated from this or this. This is noteworthy because these words can also be translated to mean subspace. Now, a subspace is also an interesting term. In mathematics, it can mean a bunch of different things, but the most relevant definition would be that of a space within another space. Within science fiction, however, it means roughly the same thing as hyperspace, but it has no associations with higher dimensions, like hyperspace does. Referring back to the Oxford Dictionary of Science Fiction, it defines subspace as follows. Subspace, a medium or dimension coexistent with our own, but which is subject to different physical laws that permit faster than light communication or travel. If you paused the video and read TV Tropes' definition of hyperspace, you'd have noticed that they define it as essentially the same thing as subspace. So to recap, we have a term that can mean 2 things. It can mean a hyperspace or a subspace. Within mathematics, there is little similarity between the terms other than they are spaces. Within science fiction, however, they are almost synonymous, relating specifically to a coexistent space that allows for faster than light travel. Now let me ask you this. What does the dangai do? The dangai is a tunnel-like space that allows those who do not have a hell butterfly to travel to and from the living world and soul society. In the novels, it was likened to a pipeline that connects 2 planets within outer space. And before any of you Bleach glaziers come at me, no, I'm not saying that the living world and the soul society are just planets. I have a video speaking about my thoughts on the subject. In other words, it is analogous to a space held within a larger space that connects 2 other spaces. With that being said, which of the following explanations seems more likely to you? 1. For no lore-specific reason, Kubo decided to make the dangai a higher dimensional space, and the means by which he tells us this is by calling it a hyper or subspace. 2. Kubo simply used the term hyper/subspace in the way many science fiction writers use it, which is to say, as a means to describe a space used for traveling large distances in a short period. In this case, it would be interdimensional or inter-realm travel. I think the latter explanation is more likely. I believe that given the dangai is a gateway connecting the soul society and the living world, it makes more sense to say that all Kubo meant by this term was that it is a space that transports you from one realm to another. The dangai having another spatial dimension changes nothing about the story. It serves no purpose. Interpreting it in a similar vein to how Star Trek, or I believe Star Wars, uses it makes far more sense, and it is congruent with the way we see the dangai depicted. In addition, to claim that the term hyperspace is being used in a mathematical sense rather than how it is used in science fiction within any fictional setting when all you have to go off of is the term itself requires more proof than the latter via the Sagan standard. In other words, Your burden of proof for claiming that it is meant in a mathematical sense is greater than claiming it is meant in a science fiction sense due to how comparatively extraordinary the first claim is. Thus, once again, this is just an attempt at glazing Bleach.
So now, sticking with the Dangai a bit more, I want to mention that the Dangai is surrounded by several stacked up layers of time currents. So I'm going to give you two interpretations of what this can mean. Either the Dangai is 20 to 2000D, or the Dangai is surrounded by thousands of space-time continuum threads. I would personally adhere to the latter interpretation because time is inherently linked with space, and this is seen within the Bleachverse itself.
This is the last argument I'll cover in this video, and it is by far the worst. In this section, ShonenKon shows a page which states that the Dangai is surrounded by, quote-unquote, a torrent of layers and layers of time. Using this statement, he puts forth the ridiculous notion that this is either one of two things. He says this either means that the Dangai is made up of 20 to 2000 dimensions, or that it is surrounded by thousands of space-time continuum threads. Now this is truly glazing at its finest. The statement says, quote-unquote, a torrent of layers and layers of time. A torrent means, quote-unquote, a strong and fast-moving stream of water or other liquid, or an overwhelming outpouring of something. Right after making this statement, the character says that the quote-unquote density of time is 2000 times higher than it is outside, which makes time move faster. According to the Bleach expert, Kubo is trying to say that the Dangai is made up of thousands of space-times or thousands of dimensions, which makes time flow faster. This is opposed to the absolutely ludicrous idea of Kubo simply trying to say that time is quote-unquote denser in the Dangai, so it flows faster than it does outside. But there's no way that's what he actually meant. Like Kubo in this statement here, Kubo is trying to say that the Dangai is made up of like 4,000 dimensions. Like the Dangai is like hyperdimensional or something, like it's multiversal or something. That's what Kubo meant here. Nothing about all that time, just hyperdimensional. There are many more things I can speak on, but this is it for now. I just wanted to show everyone watching this video that ShonenKon's word should be heavily scrutinized. He doesn't seem to understand a bit of dimensional scaling. He just fabricates nonsense and strings it together. As I said at the beginning of the video, when I sent him my original essay, he simply laughed and said he wasn't going to read it. He also hid my comment criticizing him. What this exchange proved to me is that he has no interest in if he's right or wrong. He just wants to glaze, 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 and glaze. He lives to glaze Bleach, and he doesn't care about accurately scaling the series. He misinforms either willingly or ignorantly. But given his behavior, I believe it's the former. I don't think anyone who would make a 20-minute video that believes everything they say in it would behave the way ShonenKon did. His actions are that of a person who is pitifully biased and willfully disingenuous, which is quite a shame, to be honest. Given his knowledge of Bleach, he could be making far more interesting content, but he prefers to make terrible videos where he speaks absolute nonsense. Anything to glaze Bleach, I guess. And yeah, that's about all I wanted to say. I'll probably return to consistent uploads in a few months, but most likely in early 2025. So see y'all then. P.S. Bro, stop on that glazing. Moving on, he doesn't explain what he means by quote unquote, oh no.